Sometimes the worst cruelty comes not from nature, but from the darkness in a human heart. When 72-year-old Silas Boone found that German shepherd bound with barbed wire and left to freeze in Dead Man's Gulch, he saw something that cut deeper than any mountain wind ever could. The old trapper had lost everything, his boy to war, his wife to fever, and figured his days of caring were long behind him. But there was something in that dog's eyes, still fighting despite the cold trying to claim him, that stirred feelings Silas thought had died 20 winters back. He cut those wires with shaking hands and carried the half-frozen animal home, never knowing that simple act of mercy would lead him into a valley-wide reckoning with old sins and bitter enemies. What happens when a broken man saves a dying dog, and that dog leads him to the truth about his own past? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cabin sat like a weathered scar against the white expanse of the Bitterroot Mountains, its logs darkened by decades of harsh winters and the kind of solitude that changes a man's bones. Silas Boone had built it with his own hands 43 years ago, back when his shoulders were broader and his heart carried more hope than sorrow. Now, as he pushed through the heavy wooden door with the half-frozen German shepherd cradled in his arms, the familiar creak of old timber seemed to welcome them both into a sanctuary that had seen too much grief. The dog's breathing came in shallow puffs against Silas's flannel shirt, each exhale a small victory against the cold that had nearly claimed him. Inside the cabin, the potbelly stove radiated warmth that had been banking since dawn. Fed by the split pine, Silas cut religiously each morning, a ritual that kept his hands busy and his mind from wandering too far into the dark corners where memories lived. He laid the dog on the worn quilt beside the stove, the same quilt his wife Martha had sewn during her last winter, her fingers working the needle even as the fever took her strength. The animal's coat was matted with ice and blood where the barbed wire had cut deep, but underneath the grime, Silas could see the noble lines of good breeding. This wasn't some feral mutt. Someone had cared for this dog once, trained him, loved him maybe. "Easy now, boy," Silas murmured, his voice rusty from disuse. He hadn't spoken aloud to another living thing in near 3 weeks, not since old Pete Hawkins had stopped by with supplies from town. "We're going to get you sorted." The dog's eyes, amber and intelligent despite the pain, tracked Silas's movements as he fetched warm water and clean rags from the kitchen. Those eyes held something that reminded Silas of his boy Danny, the way Danny used to look at him with such trust before the army took him away to Vietnam. Before the telegram came that autumn day in '68, 23 words that shattered a father's world. "We regret to inform you that your son, Private Daniel Boone, was killed in action while serving his country." Silas pushed the memory aside and focused on cleaning the dog's wounds. The barbed wire had been wrapped tight around the animal's legs and muzzle, cutting deep enough to leave scars, but not deep enough to kill quickly. Whoever had done this wanted the dog to suffer, wanted him to die slow and afraid in the cold. The deliberate cruelty of it made Silas's jaw clench so hard his teeth ached. As he worked, the wind picked up outside, rattling the cabin's windows and sending snow devils dancing across the meadow beyond. This was the kind of storm that could last for days, the kind that cut the valley off from the world below and left a man alone with his thoughts. Silas had weathered dozens of such storms in this cabin, but tonight felt different. Tonight, he wasn't alone. The dog whimpered softly as Silas cleaned the worst of the cuts, but he didn't try to bite or pull away. There was a resignation in the animal that spoke of intelligence, of understanding that help had finally come. When Silas finished bandaging the wounds, he sat back on his heels and really looked at the dog for the first time. The German shepherd was young, maybe 2 years old, with the kind of muscular build that spoke of good feeding and regular exercise. His ears were perfectly pointed, his coat beneath the dirt and blood, showing the deep black and tan markings of quality breeding. This wasn't a working ranch dog or a stray. This was somebody's companion, somebody's family. "Who did this to you, boy?" Silas asked, stroking the dog's head gently. "And why?" The dog's tail thumped weakly against the quilt, the first sign of spirit Silas had seen since finding him. It was a small thing, that tail wag, but it stirred something in the old trapper's chest that he'd thought was buried with Martha. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountain, but inside the cabin, a different kind of thaw was beginning. Silas hadn't realized how the silence had been eating at him, how the weight of solitude had settled into his bones like arthritis. The dog's presence, even in its weakened state, brought a warmth that had nothing to do with the stove. He made a bed for the animal from old blankets, positioning it close to the heat but not so close as to cause harm. The dog settled into it with a soft sigh, those amber eyes never leaving Silas's face. There was gratitude there, but something else too, a recognition that passed between two souls who had both known suffering. Silas prepared a simple meal of canned beef stew, more out of habit than hunger. He'd been eating the same rotation of simple foods for years now, ever since Martha died, and cooking became just another chore to mark the passage of empty days. But tonight he found himself adding an extra portion to the pot, letting the aroma fill the cabin with something approaching comfort. As the stew simmered, he settled into his worn leather chair, the one Martha had always said made him look like a mountain king holding court, and studied his unexpected guest. The dog had closed his eyes, but his breathing had steadied, and some color had returned to his gums. He would live, Silas was certain of that now. The question was what came next. In the morning, when the storm cleared, he could take the dog down to Doc Peterson in Missoula. The veterinarian would patch him up proper, maybe help find his owners. But something in Silas's gut told him this wasn't going to be that simple. The way the dog had been bound, the deliberate cruelty of it, suggested this wasn't just some random act of meanness. This felt personal, targeted. The stew finished cooking and Silas ladled himself a bowl, then prepared a smaller portion for the dog, letting it cool to room temperature. The animal ate slowly but steadily, his appetite a good sign that he was stronger than he appeared. When he finished, he laid his head back down and watched Silas with those intelligent eyes. "You're going to need a name," Silas said, more to fill the silence than anything else. "Can't keep calling you boy forever." He considered the options as he ate his own meal. The dog's coat reminded him of winter shadows, dark and light playing together like the forest in snow. There was something about the way the animal held himself, even injured, that spoke of toughness, of resilience born from hardship. "Bristle," he said finally. "You got that look about you, like you're ready to bristle up at whatever comes next." The dog's tail thumped again, as if approving of the choice. As the evening settled into the comfortable rhythm that mountain solitude teaches a man, the snap of logs in the stove, the whisper of wind through the eaves, the soft breathing of a healing animal, Silas found his mind wandering to questions he couldn't answer. Who had tortured this dog? Why leave him in Dead Man's Gulch of all places? And why did something about the whole situation feel familiar, like an echo of something he'd tried to forget? Dead Man's Gulch had earned its name back in the 1880s, when a claim jumper named Jeremiah Craw had been found frozen solid in the narrow canyon, shot through the heart by persons unknown. The story went that Craw had been stealing from other miners' claims all winter, taking just enough to avoid notice, but leaving families hungry when spring came. Justice in those days was swift and final, delivered by men who understood that survival in the mountains required certain unforgiving rules. Silas had always avoided that particular stretch of country, not out of superstition, but because it was difficult terrain that offered little in the way of game or useful trap sites. The fact that someone had chosen to leave Bristle there in that God-forsaken place suggested they knew the area well enough to understand its reputation. They wanted the dog to die where death had a history, where the cold would claim him just as it had claimed Jeremiah Craw all those years ago. The implications sent a chill through Silas that had nothing to do with the weather outside. This wasn't random cruelty. This was a message, a warning, maybe even a challenge. Someone wanted him to find that dog, wanted him to know what they were capable of doing to innocent creatures. The question was why, and more importantly, who? As the night deepened and the storm showed no signs of abating, Silas made a decision that would have surprised the man he'd been just that morning. He wasn't going to take Bristle to the veterinarian in Missoula. He was going to nurse the dog back to health himself. Here in the cabin, where Martha's presence still lingered in the corners, and Danny's memory lived in every shadow cast by firelight. More than that, he was going to find out who had done this thing, and when he did, they were going to learn that some cruelties demanded an accounting. Silas Boone might be old, might be worn down by grief and solitude, but he wasn't dead yet. And neither, thank God, was the dog sleeping peacefully by his fire. Outside, the wind howled like all the ghosts of the Bitterroot Mountains, but inside the cabin, two damaged souls had found each other in the kind of storm that either breaks a man or makes him remember who he used to be. 3 days passed before the storm broke, and in that time, Bristle transformed from a dying animal into something approaching his former self. The dog's wounds were healing clean, his appetite had returned with a vengeance, and he'd taken to following Silas around the cabin with the devotion of a creature who understood exactly how close he'd come to meeting his maker. On the 4th morning, when the sun finally pierced the cloud cover and set the snow-covered meadows sparkling like crushed diamonds, Silas decided it was time to venture back to Dead Man's Gulch, not to check his trap lines. Those could wait another day, but to look for clues about who had left Bristle to die and why. Bristle seemed to sense the purpose in Silas's movements as he strapped on his snowshoes and pulled on his heavy coat. The dog positioned himself by the door, amber eyes alert and expectant, clearly intending to accompany his rescuer. "You sure about that, boy?" Silas asked, studying the bandages that still wrapped the dog's legs. "That Gulch ain't exactly a Sunday stroll." Bristle's tail wagged once, a gesture that somehow conveyed both determination and trust. Silas had seen that look before. In Danny's eyes, the day before he shipped out to Southeast Asia, the look of someone who'd made up his mind and wouldn't be swayed by arguments about safety or common sense. "All right then," Silas said, opening the door to let the crisp mountain air flood the cabin. "But we go slow, and if those wounds start bleeding again, we turn back. No arguments." The trek to Dead Man's Gulch took twice as long as usual, partly because of the fresh snow that had drifted 3 feet deep in places, and partly because Silas found himself watching Bristle for signs of strain. But the dog moved with surprising grace despite his bandages, picking his way through the snow with the focused intensity of an animal on a mission. When they reached the spot where Silas had found Bristle, the scene looked different in the harsh morning light. The storm had covered most of the evidence with fresh snow, but Bristle immediately began investigating the area with the methodical thoroughness of a trained search dog. He circled the depression where he'd been left to die, nose to the ground, occasionally stopping to paw at something beneath the white surface. Silas watched the dog work, impressed by the intelligence and purpose in his movements. This wasn't random sniffing. Bristle was following scent trails, tracking something specific. When the dog suddenly froze and looked up at Silas with urgent eyes, the old trapper knew they'd found something important. Kneeling in the snow beside Bristle, Silas carefully brushed away the white powder until his fingers touched something that made his blood run cold. It was a piece of paper, folded and placed inside a plastic bag to protect it from the elements. Someone had deliberately left this here, positioned it exactly where they knew Silas would eventually look. With hands that trembled slightly, whether from cold or apprehension, he couldn't say. Silas opened the bag and unfolded the paper. The message inside was written in block letters with black ink, the handwriting careful and deliberate. "The dog was just the beginning. You took something that didn't belong to you. Old man, time to pay the price. You have 7 days to return what you stole, or the next one won't be an animal." Silas read the note twice, his mind racing to make sense of words that seemed to come from someone else's life. What had he stolen? From whom? He'd lived as a hermit for the better part of 20 years, barely interacting with another soul, except for the occasional supply run to town. The idea that he'd taken something valuable enough to warrant this kind of threat seemed impossible, but even as he tried to dismiss the message as the work of some deranged individual, something nagged at the edge of his memory, a familiar sensation, like trying to remember a dream that had faded with morning light. There was something about the careful handwriting, the formal tone, that stirred recognition in the deepest corners of his mind. Bristle whined softly and nosed at the paper, as if sensing the tension that had suddenly coiled in his rescuer's shoulders. The dog's eyes held a question that Silas couldn't answer. What did this mean for both of them? 7 days, Silas murmured, looking around the gulch with new eyes. The narrow canyon that had always seemed merely desolate now felt actively menacing, as if hostile eyes might be watching from the rocky walls above. Whoever had left this message knew his habits well enough to predict he'd return to this spot. They'd been watching him, studying him, planning this confrontation with the patience of a predator. The implications hit him like a physical blow. If someone had been observing him closely enough to know he'd find Bristle and nurse him back to health, then they probably knew about the cabin, about his isolation, about his vulnerabilities. The torture of an innocent animal hadn't been random cruelty. It had been bait, designed to draw him into whatever game someone was playing. But what game? And why now, after so many years of solitude? As they made their way back toward the cabin, Silas found his mind cataloging every shadow, every unusual sound, every place along the trail where an ambush might be waiting. The peaceful mountain landscape that had been his sanctuary for decades suddenly felt exposed and dangerous. Bristle seemed to sense the change in mood, staying closer to Silas's side and occasionally pausing to scan the tree line with the alertness of a soldier in hostile territory. The walk back gave Silas time to think, to sift through the fragments of his past like a prospector panning for gold. What could he have taken that someone would want back after all these years? He'd never been a thief, never been the kind of man who coveted his neighbor's possessions. His needs had always been simple: enough food to get through winter, enough warmth to survive the cold, enough solitude to heal from losses that had nearly broken him. But memories had a way of surfacing when a man was under pressure. And by the time he reached the cabin, Silas had begun to remember things he'd spent 20 years trying to forget. Not about stealing exactly, but about finding. About discoveries made during his early years in the mountains, when he'd still been searching for something besides solitude. Inside the cabin, he made coffee with hands that weren't quite steady and sat in his chair beside the fire. The threatening notes spread on the small table beside him. Bristle settled at his feet, watching with those intelligent amber eyes that seemed to understand more than any dog should. 7 days, Silas said aloud, the words tasting bitter as old coffee grounds. Whoever's behind this, they're not playing around. The note had been professionally crafted, not the random scrawling of a madman, but the calculated work of someone who understood psychological pressure. The threat was specific enough to be taken seriously, but vague enough to let Silas's imagination fill in the terrifying details. And the timeline was designed to create urgency without allowing enough time for careful planning. Bristle lifted his head and looked toward the door, ears pricked forward in alert attention. A moment later, Silas heard what the dog had detected first, the distant sound of a vehicle making its way up the mountain road that led to his cabin. In all his years of solitude, unexpected visitors had been rare enough to count on one hand, and they'd always been neighbors or supply deliveries announced well in advance. This felt different. This felt like the game was about to begin in earnest. Silas rose from his chair and moved to the window, pushing aside the curtain just enough to peer out without being seen. Through the trees, he caught glimpses of a dark pickup truck moving slowly up the winding road, taking its time as if the driver wanted to be noticed. "Well, boy," he said to Bristle, who had moved to stand beside him at the window, "looks like we're about to find out what this is really about." The truck was getting closer, its engine noise echoing off the canyon walls like a warning bell, tolling the end of peaceful days. Whatever Silas had supposedly stolen, whoever wanted it back, they weren't content to wait 7 days. They were coming for him now, and the real test of what kind of man he still was, beneath all that grief and solitude, was about to begin. The pickup truck that emerged from the tree line wasn't what Silas had expected. Instead of the menacing vehicle his imagination had conjured, it was Pete Hawkins's familiar, rust-colored Ford, moving with the careful deliberation of an old man navigating fresh snow. Silas felt his shoulders relax slightly, though Bristle remained alert beside him, watching the approaching truck with the focused intensity of a sentry. Pete Hawkins had been making supply runs up the mountain for the better part of 15 years. Ever since his own retirement from ranching had left him with too much time and not enough purpose. At 78, he was older than Silas by 6 years, but he moved with the stubborn vitality of a man who refused to acknowledge his limitations. His monthly visits had become one of the few constants in Silas's isolated existence, but as Pete's truck pulled up beside the cabin and the engine shut off, something felt different about this visit. The older man sat behind the wheel for a long moment before getting out, his weathered face serious in a way that set Silas's nerves on edge. When Pete finally emerged from the truck, he moved with the careful deliberation of someone carrying unwelcome news. "Morning." "Silas!" Pete called out as he approached the cabin, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. "Mind if I come in? Got some things we need to discuss." Silas opened the door, noting how Pete's eyes immediately went to Bristle, who had positioned himself protectively beside his rescuer. The old rancher's expression shifted from concern to surprise as he took in the sight of the German shepherd. "Well, I'll be damned," Pete said, stepping inside and stamping the snow off his boots. "Where'd you find yourself a dog?" "Dead Man's Gulch," Silas replied, closing the door behind his visitor. "Someone left him to die, bound up with barbed wire." Pete's face darkened at the news, his eyes studying Bristle with the practiced gaze of a man who'd spent his life around animals. "That's a fine-looking dog. Good breeding, by the look of him. You know who he belongs to?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out," Silas said, gesturing for Pete to take a seat at the small kitchen table. "Coffee's fresh if you want some." "Obliged," Pete said, settling into the chair with a slight grunt. His movements were more careful than usual, and Silas noticed the way the older man favored his left shoulder. "Actually, the dog might be part of why I'm here." Silas paused in the act of pouring coffee, the words hitting him like a cold wind. "What do you mean?" Pete accepted the steaming mug with a grateful nod, wrapping his gnarled hands around it for warmth. "Been some talk down in the valley about missing animals. Started maybe 3 weeks ago. Couple of ranch dogs disappeared. Then old Mrs. Patterson's cat turned up dead near Miller's Creek. Folks are starting to get nervous." The coffee suddenly tasted bitter in Silas's mouth. "What kind of nervous?" "The kind that makes people lock their doors at night and keep their children close," Pete said, his voice heavy with concern. "There's something else, too. Reason I drove up here instead of waiting for the usual monthly run." Silas felt Bristle move closer to his leg, the dog's warmth a comfort against the chill that was spreading through his chest. "I'm listening." Pete reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, placing it on the table between them with the solemnity of a man delivering a warrant. "Sheriff Dawson asked me to bring this up to you. Says it's important." The paper was official letterhead from the Ravalli County Sheriff's Department, but the message was brief and formal. "Mr. Boone, need to speak with you regarding recent incidents in the valley. Please contact my office at your earliest convenience." "Sheriff Robert Dawson," Silas read the note twice, his mind immediately connecting it to the threatening message he'd found in Dead Man's Gulch. The timing couldn't be coincidental. Someone was orchestrating events, pulling strings to create pressure from multiple directions. "You know what this is about, Pete?" Silas asked, though he suspected his friend knew more than he was letting on. The older man shifted uncomfortably in his chair, avoiding direct eye contact. "There's been some questions asked about you, Silas. Nothing official, mind you, but folks talking. About how long you've been up here alone. About what you might know about the missing animals. They think I'm involved in animal cruelty. The idea was so absurd that Silas almost laughed, but the serious expression on Pete's face killed the impulse. Not exactly, Pete said carefully, but there's some who remember stories from way back, from when you first came up to the mountains. About things you might have found during those early years, about why a man would choose to live so far from civilization. The reference hit Silas like a physical blow, stirring memories he'd buried deep beneath decades of routine and solitude. His early years in the mountains hadn't been entirely about grief and healing. There had been other reasons for his self-imposed exile, other discoveries that had convinced him civilization held more dangers than the wilderness ever could. What kind of stories? He asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Pete glanced around the cabin as if checking for eavesdroppers, then leaned forward and lowered his voice. About the old Mackenzie claim. About what you found up there before you decided to make this place your permanent home. The name hit Silas like ice water, flooding his mind with images he'd spent 20 years trying to forget. The Mackenzie claim, a played-out gold mine from the 1890s that he'd explored during his second year in the mountains, back when he'd still been searching for something besides solitude. What he'd found there hadn't been gold, but something far more valuable and infinitely more dangerous. Bristle whined softly, as if sensing the sudden tension that had filled the cabin. The dog moved to sit directly beside Silas's chair, ember eyes watchful and protective. I don't know what you're talking about, Silas said, but the words sounded weak, even to his own ears. Pete studied him with the penetrating gaze of an old man who'd learned to read the truth in other men's faces. Maybe not, but there's some who think you do, and they're not the patient sort. Word is, there's been strangers asking questions in town, offering money for information about you, about your habits, about when you come down from the mountain. The revelation explained the threatening note, the careful timing of Bristle's torture, the sense that he was being watched and studied. Someone had been preparing for this confrontation for weeks, maybe months, gathering intelligence and positioning pieces on a chessboard Silas was only now beginning to see. What kind of strangers? He asked. The kind that make honest folks nervous, Pete replied. Well-dressed city types with expensive trucks and attitudes that suggest they're used to getting what they want. They've been staying at the motel in Hamilton, asking casual questions about local history, about old mining claims and the people who might know their secrets. Silas felt the walls of his sanctuary closing in around him. The isolation that had protected him for so long was now working against him, leaving him exposed and vulnerable to forces he didn't fully understand. The threatening note had given him 7 days, but it was becoming clear that his enemies weren't interested in waiting. Pete, he said, his voice carrying a weight that made his old friend look up sharply. I need you to do something for me. Pete Hawkins had known Silas long enough to recognize the tone that meant serious business was at hand. He set down his coffee mug and leaned forward, his weathered features settling into the expression of a man ready to listen to hard truths. What do you need? Pete asked simply. Silas stood and walked to an old wooden chest that sat beneath the cabin's single window. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay items he hadn't touched in years, a .30-06 rifle that had belonged to his father, boxes of ammunition, and buried beneath it all, a leather-bound journal that chronicled his early years in the mountains. He withdrew the journal, its pages yellowed with age and filled with careful handwriting that documented discoveries he'd hoped never to revisit. I need you to take this, Silas said, returning to the table and placing the journal in front of Pete. Keep it safe, and if something happens to me, give it to Sheriff Dawson. Tell him it's got the answers to questions folks have been asking. Pete's eyes widened as he recognized the gravity of what was being entrusted to him. Silas, what kind of trouble are you in? Instead of answering directly, Silas opened the journal to a page near the middle, revealing a detailed map drawn in his own hand. The sketch showed the area around the old Mackenzie mine, with careful notations marking distances, elevations, and landmarks. But it was the small X marked deep within the mine's tunnel system that made Pete's breath catch. 22 years ago, Silas began, his voice taking on the cadence of a man unburdening himself of a long-held secret. I was still trying to figure out why God had taken my boy and left me behind. Spent most of my time exploring the old claims. Looking for something? Purpose, maybe? Or just a reason to keep putting one foot in front of the other? Bristle settled at Silas's feet. The dog's presence a comforting anchor as memories threatened to pull him into dark water. The Mackenzie claim was supposed to be played out, abandoned since the 1890s, when old Jeremiah Mackenzie gave up and moved back east. But I found evidence that someone had been working it more recently, maybe the 1940s or 50s, new timber shoring up the tunnels. Modern equipment left behind, the kind of signs that suggested serious money had been invested. Pete studied the map, his finger tracing the route Silas had marked from the mine entrance to the mysterious X. What did you find down there? Silas turned several pages in the journal, revealing photographs he'd taken with an old Polaroid camera. The images were faded, but clear enough to show wooden crates stacked in a natural cavern deep within the mine. Each crate bore military markings and serial numbers that Pete couldn't quite make out in the dim light of the cabin. Weapons, Silas said quietly. Military-grade firearms, ammunition, explosives. Enough to outfit a small army, all of it stamped with U.S. Army markings from the Korean War era. Someone had been using the Mackenzie mine as a storage depot, hiding stolen military equipment in a place no one would think to look. The implications hit Pete like a physical blow. Jesus, Silas, you're talking about a federal crime. Multiple federal crimes. I know what I'm talking about, Silas replied, his voice heavy with the weight of decades-old decisions. The question was what to do about it. I could have reported it to the authorities, but that would have meant investigations, federal agents crawling all over the mountains, my sanctuary destroyed. So I made a choice. He turned to another page in the journal, revealing detailed inventory lists written in his careful script. Page after page of weapons, ammunition types, serial numbers, and estimated quantities. It was the work of a man who understood the importance of thorough documentation. I catalogued everything, photographed the serial numbers, mapped the exact location. Then I sealed off the cavern, made it look like a natural cave-in. As far as I knew, that equipment was still sitting there, forgotten by whoever had stolen it in the first place. Pete looked up from the journal, understanding beginning to dawn in his eyes. But someone remembers. Apparently so, Silas said. And they think I took something that belongs to them. The older man studied the photographs again, his rancher's practical mind working through the implications. How much would equipment like this be worth today? To the right buyer? Collectors, survivalists, people who don't ask questions about provenance? Silas shrugged. Hundreds of thousands, maybe more. Enough to kill for, certainly enough to torture a dog to get my attention. Bristle whined softly at the mention of his ordeal, and Silas reached down to stroke the dog's head. The simple gesture seemed to calm them both. So what's your plan? Pete asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer wouldn't be simple. I'm going back to the mine, Silas said. Tonight, before these strangers decide they're done waiting for me to respond to their message. I need to see if the cache is still there, and if it is, I need to figure out who's been watching it all these years. Pete shook his head vigorously. That's fool's talk, Silas. You're 72 years old, and you'd be walking into a trap. These people have been planning this for months. You think they haven't considered that you might go back to the source? Maybe, Silas acknowledged. But I can't just sit here waiting for them to make the next move. That dog was a message, Pete. They're escalating. And next time it might not be an animal they hurt. The two old men sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation settling around them like the mountain cold. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling the cabin's windows and reminding them of their isolation. There's something else, Pete said finally, his voice reluctant. Something I didn't mention about those strangers in town. Silas looked up sharply. What? They've been asking about more than just you. They wanted to know about anyone who might have helped you over the years, anyone you might trust with important information. Pete's weathered face was grim. "They asked specifically about me." The revelation hit Silas like ice water. His decision to keep his secret had been meant to protect others, but now it seemed his silence had only painted targets on the backs of innocent people. The strangers weren't just after the stolen weapons. They were systematically identifying everyone in Silas's small circle of trust. "You need to get out of here," Silas said urgently. "Take that journal and get as far from this mountain as you can until this is over." But Pete Hawkins had spent 78 years in country that didn't forgive weakness, and his jaw set in the stubborn line that had carried him through decades of harsh winters and harder times. "Like hell," he said simply. "You saved that dog because it was the right thing to do. Now someone needs to save you for the same reason." Outside, the wind carried a sound that made both men freeze. The distant rumble of multiple vehicles making their way up the mountain road. The sound of approaching engines grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls with the deliberate pace of predators who knew their prey had nowhere to run. Silas moved to the window and carefully parted the curtain, counting at least 3 vehicles winding their way up the mountain road. 2 dark SUVs and what looked like a military-style truck bringing up the rear. "Back door," Silas said quietly to Pete, his mind automatically shifting into the tactical thinking that had kept him alive during his brief stint in Korea decades ago. "Take the journal and go out through the back. There's a trail that leads down to Miller's Creek. Follow it to the old logging road and get to Sheriff Dawson." But Pete Hawkins was already shaking his head, his weathered hands moving to check the load in the ancient .38 revolver he carried for protection against mountain cats and 2-legged predators alike. "I'm not running, Silas. These bastards want a fight, they can have one." Bristle had moved to the door, his hackles raised and a low growl rumbling in his chest. The dog's instincts were screaming danger, but there was something else in his posture. Not just fear, but recognition. Whatever scent he was picking up carried familiar notes, memories of recent pain that made his lips curl back to reveal sharp canine teeth. "Easy, boy," Silas murmured, retrieving his rifle from the chest and checking the action with practiced efficiency. The weapon was old but well-maintained, and the weight of it in his hands brought back muscle memory from a time when survival had depended on steady nerves and accurate shooting. The lead SUV came to a stop about 50 yards from the cabin, positioned to block the main road, while the other vehicles fanned out to cover potential escape routes. The tactical precision of their deployment told Silas these weren't amateurs or opportunistic thieves. They were professionals who understood the principles of containment and control. "Professional?" Pete observed, echoing Silas's thoughts as he watched the vehicles position themselves. "Military, maybe, or ex-military." The doors of the lead SUV opened simultaneously, and 3 men emerged with the coordinated movement of a practice team. They were dressed in civilian clothes, jeans, flannel shirts, work boots, but they moved with the careful discipline of soldiers advancing on an objective. The tallest of the 3, a man with graying hair and the kind of bearing that suggested command experience, raised his hands in a gesture that was meant to appear peaceful, but somehow felt more like a threat. "Silas Boone," the man called out, his voice carrying clearly across the snow-covered clearing. "My name is Colonel Marcus Webb, United States Army, retired. I'd like to have a conversation with you about some property that belongs to the government." Silas felt his jaw clench at the formal introduction. The use of military rank, even retired, was meant to establish authority and suggest legitimacy. But there was nothing legitimate about torturing a dog to get someone's attention, and the colonel's presence here meant the stakes were even higher than Silas had imagined. "I'm not in a conversational mood," Silas called back through the cabin's heavy door, "especially with men who hurt innocent animals to make a point." There was a pause, and Silas could see Webb conferring quietly with his companions. When the colonel spoke again, his tone had shifted slightly, taking on the edge of someone accustomed to having his orders followed without question. "Mr. Boone, I understand your anger about the dog, but that was an unfortunate necessity to get your attention. We've been trying to reach you through conventional channels for months, but you've proven remarkably difficult to contact. That's the point of living on a mountain, Silas replied. Sometimes a man just wants to be left alone. Webb took a few steps closer to the cabin, his hands still raised, but his body language suggesting barely controlled impatience. I'm afraid that's not possible in this case. You see, Mr. Boone, we have reason to believe you possess information about the location of certain military assets that were reported stolen from Fort Benning in 1953. Assets that, despite their age, remain the property of the United States government and pose a significant security risk in the wrong hands. The confirmation of what Silas had suspected sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the mountain cold. These men weren't thieves or black market dealers. They were government agents, which made the situation infinitely more complicated and dangerous. Even if I knew what you were talking about, Silas said. What makes you think I'd turn anything over to people who torture animals? This time, Webb's response came without hesitation, and his voice carried the cold certainty of a man who held all the cards. Because, Mr. Boone, we have your friend Pete Hawkins's granddaughter in protective custody. 12-year-old Sarah is safe for now, but her continued well-being depends entirely on your cooperation. The words hit Pete like a physical blow, draining the color from his weathered face. Silas saw his old friend's hands shake as the implications sank in. These people had been watching all of them, identifying pressure points and vulnerabilities with the thoroughness of professional intelligence operatives. You bastards, Pete whispered, his voice thick with rage and fear. She's just a child. Webb's voice carried across the clearing with the flat tone of a man discussing logistics rather than a little girl's life. Children are particularly effective motivators. Mr. Hawkins, they make people reasonable when they might otherwise choose to be stubborn. Bristle's growl had intensified, and the dog was now pacing back and forth in front of the door like a caged wolf. Whatever scent memories the approaching men had triggered, they were driving the animal to near frenzy with protective instinct and remembered trauma. What exactly do you want? Silas called out, though he already knew the answer. The location of the weapons cache you discovered in the Mackenzie mine, Webb replied without hesitation. Complete details about what you found, how much you removed, and where any remaining materials might be stored. You have documentation, we know that much. We want everything. Silas exchanged a look with Pete, seeing his own thoughts reflected in the older man's eyes. These people knew far more than they should about events that had happened over 2 decades ago. Someone had been watching, waiting, planning this confrontation with the patience of professionals who understood that time was often more valuable than force. And if I cooperate? Silas asked. Then you and your friends can return to your quiet mountain life, Webb said. The girl goes home safely, we recover government property, and everyone gets what they want. But there was something in the colonel's tone that suggested the offer wasn't as straightforward as it sounded. These men had gone to considerable trouble to arrange this confrontation, and they'd already demonstrated their willingness to use extreme measures to achieve their goals. The silence that followed Webb's ultimatum stretched like a taut wire, filled only by the whisper of wind through the pines and Bristle's low, continuous growl. Silas felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down on him. Cooperate with men who had proven their willingness to hurt innocents, or risk the life of a 12-year-old girl who had done nothing but have the misfortune of being related to his friend. Pete's face had gone ashen, his weathered hands trembling as he processed the threat to his granddaughter. Sarah was the light of his life, the only family he had left after his son had died in a car accident 3 years ago. The girl spent summers at Pete's ranch, filling the empty spaces with laughter and the kind of hope that kept an old man going through the dark months. I need proof she's safe, Pete called out, his voice cracking with emotion he couldn't hide. I need to know you really have her and that she's unharmed. Webb reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a cell phone, tapping the screen several times before holding it up so they could see. Even from a distance, Silas could make out the image, a young girl with Pete's distinctive green eyes. sitting in what appeared to be a motel room, looking scared but uninjured. "She's being well cared for," Webb said, his tone suggesting this was a routine business transaction rather than extortion involving a child. "But my associates are not known for their patience. The longer this takes, the more difficult it becomes to guarantee her continued safety." Bristle suddenly stopped pacing and fixed his attention on something beyond the main group of vehicles. His ears swiveled forward, and the quality of his growl changed from general threat response to specific recognition. Silas followed the dog's gaze and caught a glimpse of movement in the tree line. Additional personnel had been positioned to prevent any escape attempts. "How many men did you bring, Colonel?" Silas asked, though he was already counting muzzle flashes reflected off snow and calculating fields of fire. "Enough to ensure this conversation reaches a satisfactory conclusion," Webb replied. "But I'd prefer to resolve this peacefully. You're a veteran, Mr. Boone, Korea if our files are correct. You understand the importance of following orders and completing the mission." The reference to his military service was another pressure tactic, an attempt to establish common ground and appeal to old loyalties. But Silas had learned the difference between legitimate orders and criminal conspiracies during his brief time in uniform, and what these men were doing bore no resemblance to honorable service. "My mission ended in 1952, Silas said. "What you're talking about sounds more like theft than patriotism." Webb's laugh was short and humorless. "Patriotism, Mr. Boone, is sometimes about making difficult choices for the greater good. Those weapons have been sitting in that mine for over 20 years, forgotten by bureaucrats who never understood their true value. We're simply ensuring they're put to proper use." The admission confirmed what Silas had suspected. These weren't legitimate government agents recovering stolen property. They were rogue operators, using official credentials and government resources for their own purposes. The weapons cache represented significant value to the right buyers, and Sarah Hawkins was just collateral damage in their pursuit of profit. Proper use by whom? Silas asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. "By people who understand that America's enemies don't respect treaties or international law," Webb replied, his voice taking on the fervor of a true believer. "By patriots who are willing to do what our own government lacks the courage to do." The colonel's words painted a picture that made Silas's blood run cold. Domestic. Extremists with military training and access to sophisticated weapons, convinced that their cause justified any means necessary. Sarah wasn't just a hostage. She was a test case for how far these people were willing to go to achieve their goals. Pete had been listening to the exchange with growing agitation, and finally he could contain himself no longer. "Sarah has nothing to do with this," he shouted through the door. "She's just a little girl. If you want to threaten someone, threaten me. Grandfather's love is precisely what makes her so effective as leverage," Webb said with clinical detachment. "Emotional attachments are vulnerabilities. Mr. Hawkins, we're simply exploiting yours." Bristle had moved to stand directly beside Pete, sensing the older man's distress and offering what comfort his presence could provide. The dog's amber eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost human, and Silas found himself wondering what memories were stirring behind those watchful features. "You have documentation about the weapons cache," Webb continued, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Photographs, inventory lists, location details. We know this because we've been monitoring your communications and activities for months. The journal Mr. Hawkins is currently carrying contains information we need. The revelation that they'd been under surveillance for months sent another chill through Silas. These people had resources and patience that suggested significant backing, either from government agencies or private interests with deep pockets and fewer scruples than official channels would allow. "How long have you been watching us?" Silas asked. "Long enough to know that you check your trap lines every Tuesday and Friday, that Mr. Hawkins visits on the 1st of each month, and that you both have emotional attachments that can be exploited," Webb replied. "Long enough to identify pressure points and develop contingency plans for various scenarios. Pete looked stricken by the implications. Sarah's been in danger this whole time, and I didn't even know it. She's only in danger now because of choices you're about to make, Webb said. Cooperate fully, and she goes home safely. Continue to resist, and she becomes a more permanent part of our operational requirements. The euphemistic language couldn't disguise the brutal reality of what the colonel was suggesting. These men had moved far beyond simple theft or even arms dealing. They were willing to disappear a child to protect their operation. Silas felt something shift inside him, a familiar cold clarity that he hadn't experienced since his military days. The tactical situation was desperate, the odds were overwhelming, and innocent lives hung in the balance. But somewhere in the back of his mind, a plan was beginning to form. Not a plan for escape or negotiation, but for the kind of action that men like Webb wouldn't expect from a 72-year-old hermit. "I'll need to retrieve the journal from where I hid it," Silas called out, buying time while his mind worked through possibilities. "It's not here in the cabin." Webb's response came immediately, confirming that he'd anticipated this possibility. "Of course it isn't, but you're going to take us to it, Mr. Boone, all of us, together. So there are no opportunities for additional deception." The colonel was forcing a confrontation at the mine site, which meant leaving the relative safety of the cabin for the exposed terrain around the Mackenzie claim. But it also meant moving the battlefield to ground that Silas knew intimately, where 22 years of exploration had taught him every hiding place and escape route. "When?" Silas asked. "Now," Webb replied. "The longer we wait, the more likely it becomes that someone will miss Mr. Hawkins or come looking for you. We leave in 10 minutes. The journey to the Mackenzie mine took 40 minutes of careful navigation through snow-covered mountain trails, with Webb's team maintaining tactical spacing and overlapping fields of fire. Silas found himself walking point, ostensibly to guide them to the cache, but actually to study the terrain and count his enemies. Behind him, Pete moved with the careful steps of a man trying to conserve his strength for whatever ordeal lay ahead, while Bristle padded silently beside them, Embrise constantly scanning for threats. Webb had brought 6 men total, a professional team equipped with military-grade communications gear and weapons that suggested significant financial backing. They moved with the discipline of special operations veterans, but there was something in their bearing that spoke of mercenaries rather than patriots. These weren't idealistic extremists. They were soldiers for hire pursuing a payday that would set them up for life. The entrance to the Mackenzie mine sat like a wound in the mountainside, partially concealed by 2 decades of overgrowth, but still recognizable to anyone who knew what to look for. The wooden framework that had once supported the entrance had rotted away, leaving only rusted iron supports and the dark mouth of the tunnel that descended into the mountain's heart. "This is it," Silas announced, stopping beside a pile of tailings that marked where generations of miners had extracted ore from the mountain's depths. The cache is about 300 yards back, in a natural cavern that branches off from the main tunnel. Webb studied the mine entrance with the calculating gaze of a man evaluating tactical challenges. The tunnel was narrow enough that his team would have to proceed single file, unable to bring their numerical advantage to bear in the confined space underground. "Mr. Hawkins will remain here with 2 of my men," Webb decided. "You and the dog will guide myself and the others to the cache location." But as they prepared to enter the mine, Bristle suddenly stiffened and began backing away from the entrance, his hackles raised and a deep growl rumbling in his chest. The dog's reaction was so intense that even Webb's men noticed, raising their weapons and scanning for threats that weren't immediately apparent. "What's wrong with the dog?" one of Webb's operatives asked, a nervous edge creeping into his voice. Silas studied Bristle's behavior, noting how the animal's attention was fixed not on the mine entrance, but on something deeper in the shadows beyond. The dog was reacting to a scent or sound that human senses couldn't detect, and his level of agitation suggested immediate danger rather than general uneasiness. "He's been down here before," Silas realized aloud. the pieces of a larger puzzle suddenly clicking into place. "Haven't you, boy? You know this place." Webb's expression sharpened with interest. "What do you mean?" But before Silas could answer, the sound of approaching vehicles echoed off the canyon walls, multiple engines moving fast up the access road they'd just traveled. Webb's team immediately took defensive positions, weapons trained on the tree line. But their leader seemed more annoyed than surprised by the development. "Right on schedule," Webb muttered, checking his watch with the satisfaction of a man whose plans were proceeding exactly as intended. The first vehicle to emerge from the forest was a black SUV with government plates, followed by two more identical vehicles moving in precise convoy formation. As they came to a stop in the clearing below the mine, Silas caught sight of the Federal Bureau of Investigation logos on their doors, and his heart sank with the realization that the situation had just become infinitely more complex. The lead vehicle's doors opened, and Agent Sandra Hayes stepped out with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to taking charge of crime scenes. She was younger than Silas had expected, maybe 45, with the kind of professional bearing that suggested extensive field experience. Behind her came a team of agents who moved with the same disciplined coordination as Webb's mercenaries, but with the added authority of legitimate federal law enforcement. "Colonel Webb," Agent Hayes called out, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "I think we need to talk." Webb's response was a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. Agent Hayes, right on time as always. The exchange between them carried undertones that made Silas's blood run cold. This wasn't a confrontation between law enforcement and criminals. It was a meeting between business partners who had arranged to rendezvous at the mine site. Webb's rogue operation wasn't as rogue as he'd led them to believe. "The situation has changed," Hayes announced, approaching the mine entrance with the confidence of someone who knew she held the superior position. "Washington wants this wrapped up cleanly, with no loose ends or complications that might require congressional oversight." "And the old man's cooperation?" Webb asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Hayes glanced at Silas with the kind of clinical assessment usually reserved for evidence rather than human beings. "No longer necessary. We've located the cash through other means." The revelation hit Silas like a physical blow. These people had never needed his cooperation. They'd been using him as a stalking horse, a way to confirm the location and assess any security measures he might have put in place. His journal, his photographs, his careful documentation of the weapons cache had all been irrelevant from the beginning. Then why the elaborate charade? Silas asked, though he suspected the answer would be something he didn't want to hear. Agent Hayes consulted a tablet she'd retrieved from her vehicle, scrolling through what appeared to be official documentation. "Because, Mr. Boone, you represent what our analysts call a persistent security risk. Your knowledge of the cache, your documentation of government property, your potential testimony in any future legal proceedings, all of these factors make you a complication that needs to be resolved." The euphemistic language couldn't disguise what she was really saying. They intended to eliminate everyone who knew about the weapons cache, including Pete and his granddaughter. The whole elaborate operation, the torture of Bristle, the threats, the forced march to the mine had been designed to get all the witnesses in one isolated location where they could be permanently silenced, but it was what happened next that truly shattered Silas's understanding of the situation. Bristle, who had been growing increasingly agitated throughout the conversation, suddenly broke away from the group and bounded toward Agent Hayes with the enthusiasm of a dog greeting a beloved owner. The federal agent's stern expression softened into genuine affection as she knelt to embrace the German shepherd, stroking his ears with the familiarity of long association. "Hello, Kaiser," she murmured, using a name that made Bristle's tail wag with recognition. "Did you do good work, boy? Did you lead them right where we needed them to go?" The betrayal hit Silas like ice water. Bristle, the tortured, abandoned dog he'd rescued and nursed back to health, was a federal asset. A tracking device with teeth and loyalty, trained to lead unsuspecting targets exactly where his handlers wanted them to go. The wounds, Silas said, his voice hollow with understanding. The barbed wire, the hypothermia, all carefully staged, Hayes confirmed, still stroking the dog, who had manipulated his emotions with the skill of a master con artist. Kaiser is one of our best tracking assets. The injuries were superficial, designed to generate sympathy and ensure you'd take him in. We needed someone to guide you here, and emotional attachment proved more reliable than technological surveillance. Pete's face had gone pale with the realization of how completely they'd been played. My granddaughter is perfectly safe at her school in Billings, Hayes said dismissively. The photograph was taken during routine surveillance. We never had any intention of harming a child. That would be counterproductive to our objectives. Webb stepped forward, his expression suggesting he was ready to move to the next phase of their operation. Now that the emotional manipulation is complete, perhaps we can proceed with the actual mission. But Silas wasn't listening to their plans anymore. His attention was focused on Kaiser, the dog he'd known as Bristle, and the way the animal's amber eyes now held a different kind of intelligence. Not the grateful devotion of a rescued creature, but the calculating awareness of a professional asset evaluating his next assignment. The realization that everything he'd felt, every moment of connection and purpose that the dog had restored to his life, had been nothing more than sophisticated manipulation struck deeper than any physical wound could have managed. He'd been wrong about everything, the threat, the stakes, even the nature of the creature he'd tried to save. And now, standing in the shadow of a mine that held secrets worth killing for, Silas understood that the real game was just beginning. The betrayal settled into Silas's bones like mountain cold, numbing him to everything except the bitter clarity of understanding how completely he'd been manipulated. Kaiser, he couldn't think of the dog as Bristle anymore, sat beside Agent Hayes with the satisfied air of a professional who had completed his assignment flawlessly. Every moment of connection, every stirring of hope and purpose the animal had awakened in him, had been nothing more than sophisticated psychological warfare. But even as the emotional devastation threatened to overwhelm him, Silas's mind was working through the tactical implications of what he'd learned. Hayes and Webb were partners in an operation that went far beyond simple theft. They were using federal resources and legitimate authority to cover what amounted to the largest arms smuggling operation in modern history. The weapons cache in the Mackenzie mine was just the beginning. You're not here to recover stolen property, Silas said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. You're here to steal it. Hayes looked up from Kaiser, her expression shifting back to professional detachment. We're here to ensure that valuable military assets don't fall into the wrong hands. Mr. Boone, the fact that these particular assets will be put to productive use by patriots who understand their true value is simply a beneficial outcome. Patriots! Pete spat, his weathered face twisted with disgust. You mean terrorists? Webb's smile was cold as winter shadow. One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, Mr. Hawkins. The government that abandoned those weapons in that mine for 70 years has proven it lacks the will to use them properly. We're simply correcting that oversight. As they spoke, Hayes's team had been setting up equipment around the mine entrance. Sophisticated drilling gear, explosives, and excavation tools that suggested they intended to extract the entire cache in a single operation. This wasn't a simple recovery mission. It was a full-scale mining operation designed to strip the cavern of everything valuable. How long have you been planning this? Silas asked, though he was really trying to buy time to study his options. The tactical situation was hopeless. 12 armed professionals against 2 old men with 1 rifle. Between them, but his military training had taught him that hopeless situation sometimes created opportunities that careful planning never. It could. 3 years, Hayes replied, checking her tablet as her team continued their preparations. Ever since our intelligence assets identified you as the source of certain anonymous tips about weapons caches in the Pacific Northwest. Your documentation was remarkably thorough, Mr. Boone, detailed enough to guide us to several smaller sites before we focused on the Mackenzie mine. The revelation that his old reports to various law enforcement agencies had been traced back to him explained how they'd found him in the first place. Decades ago, he'd tried to do the right thing by anonymously reporting smaller weapons caches he'd discovered during his explorations, never realizing that each report was building a profile that would eventually lead corrupt agents directly to him. "You've been stealing from every cache I reported," he said, understanding flooding through him like ice water, recovering, Webb corrected, and putting the materials to productive use. "Do you have any idea how much good those weapons have done in the hands of people willing to fight for American values in places our own government lacks the courage to intervene?" The colonel's words painted a picture that made Silas's blood run cold. Weapons from forgotten military caches being funneled to extremist groups around the world, all under the cover of federal authority and patriotic rhetoric. The scope of the operation was staggering, and the implications for national security were catastrophic. Kaiser suddenly stood and padded over to where Silas was standing, looking up at him with those amber eyes that had once seemed so grateful and trusting. The dog's behavior was subtle, a positioning that placed him between Silas and the nearest federal agent, a stance that suggested readiness for action rather than passive observation. Something in the animal's expression had changed, and for a moment Silas glimpsed something that reminded him of the creature he'd rescued from Dead Man's Gulch. Not gratitude or manipulation, but a kind of professional assessment that suggested Kaiser was evaluating more than just the tactical situation. "The mine's been sealed for 22 years, Silas said, addressing Hayes while keeping his attention on the dog's subtle movements. "How do you know the cache is still intact?" Hayes consulted her tablet again, scrolling through what appeared to be geological survey data. "Ground-penetrating radar conducted over the past 6 months has confirmed the presence of metallic objects in the approximate location you documented. The cavern appears to be intact, and the metal signatures are consistent with military weapons and ammunition." But as she spoke, Silas noticed something that made his tactical instincts prickle with warning. Kaiser had moved again, this time positioning himself near the mine entrance, and his attention was focused not on the human conversation, but on something deeper in the shadows beyond. The dog's ears were pricked forward, his body tense with the kind of alertness that suggested immediate danger. "There's something else down there," Silas realized, the pieces of a larger puzzle suddenly clicking into place. "Something you don't know about." Webb's expression sharpened with interest. "What do you mean?" But before Silas could answer, Kaiser began backing away from the mine entrance, his hackles raised and a low whine escaping his throat. The dog's reaction was identical to what Silas had witnessed earlier, but now he understood what was triggering it. Not fear of confined spaces or memories of past trauma, but recognition of a specific threat that lay waiting in the darkness below. "The mine's not empty," Silas said, his voice carrying the certainty of sudden understanding. "Someone else has been using it." The words had barely left his mouth when the first explosion echoed from deep within the mountain, followed immediately by the distinctive rattle of automatic weapons fire. Hayes' team immediately took defensive positions, weapons trained on the mine entrance. But their formation suggested they were as surprised by the development as everyone else. "What the hell?" Webb began. But his words were cut off by a second explosion, this one much closer to the surface. Dust and debris erupted from the mine entrance, and the acrid smell of high explosives filled the air. Kaiser was now openly agitated, pacing back and forth with the nervous energy of an animal caught between competing instincts. His training told him to stay with his handlers, but something deeper was pulling him away from the mine entrance and toward the relative safety of the tree line. "The cache was bait," Silas said, understanding flooding through him like revelation. "Someone's been waiting for you to come looking for it." Hayes was barking orders into her radio, trying to establish contact with assets that might be able to provide tactical support. But the mountain terrain was notorious for interfering with communications. They were on their own, facing an unknown enemy in terrain that offered limited options for escape or maneuver. A third explosion, closer still, sent a shower of rocks cascading down the mountainside. But this time, in the brief flash of light that accompanied the blast, Silas caught sight of figures moving in the mine entrance, armed men wearing military-style gear who were advancing toward the surface with the coordination of a professional assault team. "How many?" Webb shouted, his earlier confidence replaced by the urgent pragmatism of a soldier under fire. But Silas wasn't counting enemies anymore. His attention was focused on Kaiser, who had suddenly stopped pacing and was looking directly at him with an expression that seemed almost human in its intensity. For a moment, man and dog regarded each other across a battlefield that had suddenly become infinitely more complex, and Silas found himself wondering if the manipulation had been as one-sided as he'd assumed. The animals' eyes held a message that transcended their training and conditioning, a recognition that the situation had moved beyond the parameters of anyone's plan, and that survival might depend on alliances that defied the simple categories of asset and target. Handler and subject, another explosion shook the mountainside, and in the chaos that followed, Kaiser made a choice that surprised everyone present. Instead of retreating to his handlers or following his training protocols, the dog bounded directly to Silas's side and took up a defensive position that was unmistakably protective. Whatever was coming out of that mine, Kaiser had decided that his best chance of survival lay with the old mountain man who had shown him kindness, even if that kindness had been based on deception. The first gunman emerged from the mine entrance like a specter rising from the depths of the mountain, his tactical gear black against the white snow and his weapons sweeping the clearing with professional precision. He was followed immediately by 3 more figures, all moving with the coordinated efficiency of a special operations team that had been lying in wait for exactly this moment. Hayes's federal agents responded with their own training, taking cover behind their vehicles and returning fire with the disciplined volleys of law enforcement professionals. But Webb's mercenaries reacted differently. Instead of engaging the new threat, they began positioning themselves to use Silas and Pete as human shields, their weapons trained on the old men rather than the enemy emerging from the mine. "Drop your weapons," the lead gunman called out in accented English that Silas couldn't immediately place. "You are trespassing on claimed territory." Kaiser pressed closer to Silas's side, his body trembling with conflicted instincts as gunfire erupted around them. The dog's amber eyes darted between his federal handlers and the old mountain man who had shown him genuine kindness, his training warring with something deeper that defied simple conditioning. Webb grabbed Pete by the collar and pressed his sidearm against the older man's temple, using him as a shield while he tried to assess the tactical situation. "How many hostiles?" he shouted to his team, but the answer came in the form of more gunfire from multiple positions around the mine entrance. "At least 8, one of his operatives replied, his voice tight with the stress of a firefight that had gone sideways faster than anyone had anticipated. Professional-grade equipment, coordinated fields of fire, these aren't amateurs. Agent Hayes was speaking rapidly into her radio, calling for backup that Silas knew would never arrive in time. The mountain terrain that had made this location perfect for hiding stolen weapons also made it nearly impossible for outside forces to provide tactical support. They were on their own, caught between competing criminal organizations in a battle over stolen military hardware. The weapons cache, Silas realized aloud, understanding flooding through him as another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. It's not just bait, it's already been claimed by someone else. The lead gunman advanced carefully across the clearing, his weapon trained on Webb, while his team maintained covering positions. As he moved closer, Silas could see the distinctive markings on his gear, Cyrillic lettering and symbols that suggested Eastern European origins. "You have been warned to stay away from this site," the man called out, his accent now clearly identifiable as Russian. "The materials here are under the protection of serious people who do not appreciate interference." Webb's face had gone pale with the realization that they'd walked into a trap that went far beyond anything he'd anticipated. The weapons cache wasn't just sitting in the mine, waiting to be recovered. It had already been claimed by international criminals with the resources and ruthlessness to eliminate anyone who threatened their operation. "We're federal agents," Hayes shouted, trying to establish some kind of authority in a situation that had moved far beyond the reach of legitimate law enforcement. "This is United States territory." The Russian's laughter was harsh and without humor. "Your badges mean nothing here, Agent Hayes. Your government's corruption has made you our unwitting partners in many profitable ventures. This is simply another business transaction." The revelation that the Russians knew Hayes by name sent a chill through Silas that had nothing to do with the mountain cold. This wasn't a chance encounter or a territorial dispute. It was a carefully orchestrated confrontation between criminal organizations that had been watching each other for months. Kaiser suddenly broke away from Silas's side and bounded toward the tree line, drawing gunfire from both sides as he disappeared into the forest with the fluid grace of an animal following deeply ingrained survival instincts. But instead of fleeing the battle entirely, the dog circled back through the trees, appearing on the flank of the Russian position with the tactical awareness of a military asset who understood how to exploit enemy weaknesses. "The dog's still working," Pete observed, his voice tight with pain as Webb maintained his grip. "But not for who we thought." Silas watched Kaiser's movements with growing understanding. The animal wasn't fleeing or randomly seeking safety. He was executing a flanking maneuver designed to provide intelligence about enemy positions and create opportunities for tactical advantage. But who was he working for now? The answer came when Hayes's radio crackled to life with a voice that spoke in fluent Russian, followed immediately by English translation. "Agent Hayes, your asset is providing real-time intelligence on hostile positions. Recommend immediate tactical withdrawal to secondary staging area." The federal agents began a coordinated retreat toward their vehicles, but the Russians were ready for the maneuver. More gunfire erupted from concealed positions, and Silas realized that the entire clearing had been turned into a killing ground by people who had been planning this confrontation far longer than anyone on the American side had suspected. Webb was dragging Pete toward his own vehicle, still using the older man as a human shield, when Silas made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of seeking cover or trying to escape, he began walking deliberately toward the mine entrance, his hands raised, but his expression set with the kind of determination that had carried him through impossible situations decades ago. "Silas, what the hell are you doing?" Pete shouted, but the old mountain man was already committed to a course of action that would either save them all or get them killed in the next 60 seconds. Silas's deliberate approach toward the mine entrance caught everyone by surprise, including the Russian operatives who had been using the terrain to maximum tactical advantage. The old mountain man walked with the steady pace of someone who had made peace with whatever consequences his actions might bring. His weathered hands visible and empty, but his bearing suggesting purpose rather than surrender. "Hold fire," the Russian leader called out in accented English, his weapon tracking Silas's movement, but his trigger discipline holding firm. There was something in the old man's approach that suggested more than simple desperation, a kind of authority that transcended the immediate tactical situation. "I know what's really in that mine," Silas announced, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing, despite the echo of gunfire that still rang in the mountain air. "And I know why you've been waiting for someone to come looking for it." The Russian's eyes narrowed with interest, but he maintained his defensive position while gesturing for his team to hold their current positions. Behind him, Silas could see more figures moving in the mine entrance, not just the assault team that had emerged to engage Hayes and Webb, but technical personnel with equipment that suggested a sophisticated extraction operation. The weapons cache was cleaned out years ago, Silas continued, stopping just outside effective small arms range, but close enough that his words would carry without shouting. What's down there now is something much more valuable, and much more dangerous. Webb's voice cut across the clearing with the frustrated anger of a man whose carefully laid plans had disintegrated into chaos. He's lying! The ground-penetrating radar confirmed metallic signatures, consistent with military weapons, but the Russian leader was studying Silas with the calculating gaze of someone who had learned to recognize truth in high-stakes situations. Continue, old man. You have perhaps 30 seconds before my patience expires. Silas took a deep breath, knowing that what he said next would determine whether any of them survived the next few minutes. The metallic signatures your radar detected aren't weapons. They're the containers for what's left of a chemical weapons research program that was shut down in the 1950s. Someone's been using the mine to store materials that the government was supposed to destroy decades ago. The revelation hit the clearing like a physical shockwave. Chemical weapons represented a threat that went far beyond simple arms smuggling. They were materials that could devastate entire cities if they fell into the wrong hands, and their presence explained why so many different criminal organizations had been circling the site like vultures. Agent Hayes' voice crackled across her radio as she tried to establish contact with federal authorities who could confirm or deny Silas's claims. But the mountain terrain continued to interfere with communications, leaving them isolated with information that could reshape their understanding of the entire operation. You lie, the Russian said, but there was uncertainty in his voice that hadn't been there before. Our intelligence indicated conventional weapons only. Your intelligence was fed false information by the same people who've been manipulating everyone else, Silas replied. The chemical weapons are real, and they're unstable after 70 years of storage in an uncontrolled environment. That's why your extraction team has been moving so carefully. They know what they're really dealing with. Kaiser suddenly emerged from the tree line, moving with purpose, rather than the random flight of a frightened animal. The dog approached Silas with the confident stride of an asset returning to his primary handler. But there was something different in his amber eyes, a recognition that transcended his training and conditioning. The German shepherd positioned himself beside Silas, not in the protective stance he'd adopted earlier, but in the alert posture of a working dog awaiting orders. Whatever confusion had marked his behavior during the firefight had resolved into clear purpose, and that purpose was clearly aligned with the old mountain man who had shown him genuine kindness. The dog knows, Silas said, reaching down to stroke Kaiser's head with the gentle touch of a man who understood that trust was more valuable than gold. He's been down in those tunnels, hasn't he? That's how you've been monitoring the site, using him to navigate areas too dangerous for human personnel. The Russian's expression confirmed what Silas had suspected. Kaiser wasn't just a tracking asset or a manipulation tool. He was a reconnaissance specialist, trained to work in hazardous environments where his enhanced senses could detect threats that instruments might miss. The containers are compromised, Silas continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen similar situations during his military service. That's why you've been taking so long with the extraction. Why you've been waiting for someone else to trigger whatever contingency plans are in place. Webb's face had gone ashen as the implications sank in. His pursuit of stolen conventional weapons had led him into a situation involving chemical agents that could kill thousands if mishandled. The scope of the threat had escalated beyond anything his mercenary organization was equipped to handle. So what do you propose, old man? The Russian asked, his weapon still trained on Silas, but his finger no longer resting on the trigger. Silas looked around the clearing at the various factions who had been fighting over what they thought was a simple arms cache. Then back at the mine entrance, where death waited in corroded containers that had been forgotten by the government that created them. "I propose we stop shooting at each other," he said simply, "and start figuring out how to keep this mountain from becoming the biggest environmental disaster in Montana history." 6 weeks later, Silas stood on the porch of his cabin watching the last of the federal containment teams pack up their equipment from the valley below. The Mackenzie mine had been sealed with concrete and steel, its dangerous contents now entombed under layers of protective material that would keep the chemical weapons from threatening anyone for generations to come. The official reports would classify it as a routine environmental remediation project. But Silas knew the truth about how close they'd all come to disaster. Kaiser, he'd kept the name, deciding it suited the dog better than Bristle, lay at his feet in the afternoon sunshine, content to watch the world go by with the peaceful air of an animal who had found his true home. The German shepherd's injuries from that day at the mine had healed completely, leaving only faint scars that served as reminders of how complicated loyalty could become when duty conflicted with genuine affection. The confrontation that had begun with gunfire and ended with grudging cooperation between enemies had taken 3 days to fully resolve. Once the Russian leader, who turned out to be a former Spetsnaz colonel named Volkov, understood the true nature of the threat they were all facing, professional pragmatism had overcome criminal rivalry. Chemical weapons didn't respect national boundaries or organizational loyalties, and their potential for catastrophic release had made everyone's survival dependent. On working together, Agent Hayes had proven surprisingly willing to negotiate once she realized that her career prospects were better served by containing the situation than by pursuing prosecutions that would expose decades of government negligence. Webb's mercenary organization had been quietly disbanded, its members scattered to overseas contracts where their knowledge of the operation couldn't pose a security risk. The colonel himself had disappeared into the kind of witness protection program that didn't officially exist, trading his silence for a comfortable retirement in a country that didn't extradite to the United States. Pete Hawkins climbed the steps to the cabin, with the careful movements of a man whose recent experiences had reminded him of his mortality. But his weathered face held the satisfaction of someone who had survived something that should have killed him. In his hands, he carried a thermos of coffee and a manila envelope that contained the final piece of paperwork from the federal bureaucracy that had taken over their lives for the past month and a half. "Sheriff, Dawson sends his regards," Pete announced, settling into the chair beside Silas with a grunt of relief. "Says the county's officially closing the investigation into missing animals. Apparently, all the evidence got classified at a level way above his security clearance." Silas accepted the coffee gratefully, noting how the simple ritual of sharing a hot drink with an old friend had taken on new significance after their shared ordeal. The isolation that had once been his sanctuary now felt less necessary, as if the events at the mine had burned away some of the protective barriers he'd built around his heart. "What about Sarah?" he asked, though he already knew the answer from Pete's relaxed demeanor. "Safe at school, completely unaware that she was ever in any kind of danger," Pete replied with the relief of a grandfather who had learned not to take such simple blessings for granted. The whole kidnapping threat was just psychological manipulation, but it worked better than they probably expected. Kaiser lifted his head at the mention of psychological manipulation, his amber eyes holding the kind of intelligence that suggested he understood more about his role in recent events than anyone gave him credit for. The dog's loyalties had proven more complex than his training, and his decision to protect Silas during the final confrontation had been instrumental in convincing all parties that cooperation was preferable to mutual destruction. "Agent Hayes came by yesterday while you were in town," Silas said, stroking the dog's head with the gentle touch of genuine affection. "Wanted to know if I'd consider keeping Kaiser permanently. Seems his psychological profile indicates he's developed what she called problematic emotional attachments to civilian personnel. Pete's laugh was rich with the kind of humor that comes from surviving impossible situations. Problematic emotional attachments. That's bureaucrat speak for the dog likes you better than he likes his government handlers. Something like that, Silas agreed. Turns out loyalty is harder to fake than they thought. The manila envelope contained Kaiser's official transfer documents, releasing him from federal service and reassigning his care to a private citizen who had demonstrated exceptional competence in animal husbandry. The paperwork was thick with legal language designed to protect the government from liability, but the practical effect was simple. The dog was free to choose his own home. As the afternoon wore on and the last of the federal vehicles disappeared down the mountain road, Silas found himself reflecting on how dramatically his life had changed since that morning when he'd found a tortured animal in Dead Man's Gulch. The solitude that had been his refuge for 2 decades was still there when he needed it, but it no longer felt like a prison built from grief and regret. The events at the mine had reminded him that the world beyond his mountains still needed men who understood the difference between right and wrong, who were willing to act when action was required, regardless of the personal cost. He might be 72 years old, but he wasn't dead yet, and neither was his capacity to make a difference when it mattered most. Kaiser stretched in the sunshine, his scarred body a testament to resilience and the possibility of healing, even from the worst kinds of damage. The dog's presence had taught Silas that trust could survive deception, that loyalty could transcend training, and that sometimes the most important connections formed in the aftermath of betrayal rather than in spite of it. As the sun set behind the peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and crimson, Silas Boone understood that his days of isolation were ending, not because his sanctuary had been violated, but because he'd remembered that some things were worth protecting beyond his own peace of mind. Tomorrow, there would be new challenges, new opportunities to choose between safety and service. But tonight, there was just an old man, his dog, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that when it mattered most, they'd chosen to stand together against forces that would have destroyed them separately. The mountain wind carried the scent of coming spring, and for the first time in 20 years, Silas found himself looking forward to seeing what the changing seasons would bring.